Hi, it's Dr. Kim. Hello, Bio 165. It's time for our supplemental lecture. So that is on the central nervous system here. Hopefully I'll be able to keep this stable. Okay, so let's get going. So brain regions in organization, adults' brains have 4 regions. There is the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem consisting of the midbrain, pons, and medulla, as well as the cerebellum. We need to know the hemispheres. There's the left and right, and that's the larger portion. The diencephalon is up here in purple. The cerebellum is the small, it's like a miniature cerebrum, and you have the midbrain or the brainstem, which has the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. So if you look at a different version of this picture, you'll see the midbrain is the top portion, the pons is like a belly portion, and the medulla is at the very bottom there. So brain regions and organization, a couple things we should know about this one is the gray matter, which is the short, non-myelinated, meaning there's no fatty tissue, neurons and cell bodies. White matter is myelinated. Basic pattern for the central nervous system is going to be the central cavity that's surrounded by the gray matter. So the gray matter is in the center, and the white matter is on the outside of it. Couple things. Spinal cord exhibits a basic pattern, but the pattern changes with ascent into the brainstem. So looking at this, the central cavity there, the spinal cord, you have the inner gray matter, and the spinal cavity is a small little hole in the center there, and all the white matter is the outside. Gray matter, as you can see, has within it neuron cell bodies and short myelinated neurons. The white matter has mostly myelinated axons with some non-myelinated axons in there as well. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows through chambers called ventricles. There are many, and you will need to know the flow. If you haven't caught on by now, I really like tracing a drop of something or a particle of something. So ventricles are fluid-filled chambers that are continuous to one another in the central canal of the spinal and to the central canal of the spinal cord. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid and lined with ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are neuroglial cells. They're just lining cells there and supportive cells. They're paired lateral ventricles, which is the first. It's large C-shaped chambers located deep in each hemisphere. The pair is separated by a septum pellucidum. Each lateral ventricle is connected to the third one. So it goes from lateral ventricle to the third through the interventricular foramen. See this pattern coming up here? This is really important. The third ventricle then goes to the fourth via the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle lies in the hindbrain. Biggest portion, the three connect to the fourth, the openings connect to the fourth ventricle, to the subarachnoid space that surrounds the brain. And then you have the lateral apertures on the side walls and the median aperture in the roof. A couple things. Fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. So this is a picture. The thing that I might do is ask you to label something like this, and then for another few points, I would want you to trace a drop of the cerebrospinal fluid. So then you have the cerebral hemispheres form the superior part or the very top of the brain. It accounts for 83%, almost all of the brain mass. Surface markings that you will see is the gyri or the gyri are the ridges, and the sulci or the sulcus which is singular, is the shallow grooves. Fissures are deep grooves, and two of note that you should know is the longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres, and the transverse cerebral fissure, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Which brings us to this one. You can see the different lobes we need to know about. The frontal lobe there, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe would be further down, better viewed in a different angle, from a different angle. Next one, you can see the temporal lobe down here. You've got the brainstem going down this way. You have the cerebellum there, and you have the transverse cerebral fissure there. Several sulci divide each hemisphere into 5 lobes. There's the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the insula. The first 4 are named after the overlying skull bones, where the skull bones are. The insular bone is buried under portions of the temporal parietal. The insular lobe is the deep lobe, which is buried under the portions of the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. The cerebral hemispheres. So the major sulci that divides the lobes, sulci are the ones that are sunken in, like you're down when you're sulking, so to speak. The central sulcus divides into the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe and the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. The parietal occipital sulcus separates the occipital and the parietal lobes. Lateral sulcus outlines the temporal lobes. Each hemisphere has 3 basic regions: the cerebral cortex, which is the surface, the superficial area, the white matter is internal. Basal nuclei are deep within the white matter. So just so you know, white matter in the spinal cord is on the outside, gray matter on the inside. It's the opposite in the brain area. Cerebral cortex is the executive suite of the brain. It's the site of the conscious mind, awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, and understanding. It's very thin. It's 2 to 4 millimeters. It's the superficial layer of gray matter, composed of neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, glial cells, and blood vessels, but no axons. It actually makes up 40% of the brain's mass. Cerebral cortex is going to be the, the next portion is going to be about the functional imaging, PET or MRI, of the brain show specific motor and sensory functions that are located in discrete cortical areas of the brain called domains. Higher functions are spread over many, many areas. 4 general considerations of the cerebral cortex contains 3 types of functional areas. There's the motor, sensory, and association areas. The motor areas control voluntary movement. Sensory areas are in charge of conscious awareness of sensation, and association areas are parts that are integrative. They integrate diverse information. They associate pieces of information that come into the system. Each hemisphere is concerned with the contralateral side, which means the right side. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but the right side is in control of the left side of the body. The left side of the brain is controls the right side of the body. Lateralization or specialization of the cortical function can occur in only one hemisphere. Conscious behavior involves the entire cortex in one way or the other. Motor areas, we're going to talk about the primary motor area. I'm sure you guys can see this. So when we look at motor, where were we? When we talk about motor areas, it's located in the frontal lobe. Motor areas act to control voluntary movement, like we said. Primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus. Premotor cortex is anterior to the precentral gyrus. Broca's area is anterior to the inferior premotor area, and the frontal eye field is within and anterior to the premotor cortex, which is superior to the Broca's area. I don't need you to know where any of this stuff is. I just need to know that the motor areas, the 4 areas that I need you to know about, is the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, Broca's area, and frontal eye field. There you have it. I do like this brain a lot. Primary or somatic motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus, the frontal lobe, like we said. There's the pyramidal cells that are located there. They're large neurons that allow for conscious control of precise skeletal muscle movements. Pyramidal tracts or corticospinal is formed from long axons that project down the spinal cord. Somatotropy is, when it comes to that, all muscles of the body can be mapped to an area of the primary motor cortex, which is great. The motor homunculus or homunculi is an upside down caricature that represents contralateral motor innervation in the body regions. This is the homunculus that tells you what part, which part of the brain is that which controls, and is controlled by which part of the body. Looking at the premotor cortex, it helps plan the movements. It's like the staging area for skilled motor activities. It controls learned, repetitious, or pattern motor skills. And it coordinates simultaneous or sequential actions. Controls voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. Broca's area is present in one hemisphere, usually on the left. Motor speech area that directs muscles of speech production. Active in planning speech and voluntary motor activities. Broca's area is actually one of the 2 speech areas that have gotten quite a bit of press regarding how they do what they do and how they govern what they govern. Broca's area is actually that which controls the muscles of speech. So if that area is damaged, you'll start hearing mumbling, like the Tasmanian devil type of mumbling, and you won't be able to speak in a way that is well understood. So the way you would remember Broca's area damage is broken speech. Broca's area, broken speech. Okay. Also really like this. So Broca's area should be right here. The other one that's really famous is Wernicke's area in this area here. This actually has to do with word association. And so what happens is that you're able to form the muscles for speech, so you're able to pronounce sounds that are like words, but in fact, you produce like words that are not properly associated. Like, work and sign, I'm tabled. Like, so all the words mean something, but they don't make sense together. So when we look at Broca's area, we talked about broken speech. Wernicke's area is going to be word salad. That's what it's going to produce. This is a really great picture of the half brain. The fissure that divides the left and right hemispheres is the longitudinal fissure, which is the long ways. It's a fissure. Deep groove. The piece of tissue that actually connects the left and right hemispheres together is called the corpus callosum. Then you have the sensory areas, the areas of the cortex that's concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. It occurs in the parietal, insular, temporal, and occipital lobes. The 8 areas that are the main areas of sensory input is called, or reception, is called the primary somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association cortex, visual areas, auditory areas, vestibular cortex, olfactory cortex, gustatory cortex, and the visceral sensory area. Please do not be surprised or alarmed if I were to ask for, name 3 of the 8 sensory areas in the cerebral cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyri of the parietal lobe. It receives general, sensory information from skin, and proprioceptors, which are receptors of that actually, how do I say this? Of your own body within yourself, of skeletal muscle, joints, and tendons. So proprioception of those tissues are actually going to be preventative against injury or being stretched too far. It's capable of spatial discrimination, which is the identification of a body region being stimulated. And the somatosensory homunculus is, once again, the upside down input from body regions. We talked about that already. I think we already did this piece.